Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Wells.
We appreciate all the support on the recent content. We do actually have a comment to read from our latest short regarding Jimmy Butler and the Miami Heat. There's been rumors about Jimmy Butler being traded, and only Kel too on YouTube. He said he ain't going to Dallas. They already have a set team. Him or Clay doesn't want to come off the bench. Yeah, agreed. I mean, I don't think it's. I think Dallas is probably one of the more, I guess, unrealistic kind of destinations for him. I think there's obviously other teams that can put together a more realistic package, and I think as nice, I guess, as it would be for Dallas to get another star, I just don't think it's possible considering like the CBA and how things work in the NBA now. But yeah, I agree.
Yeah, we kind of talked about that, in our previous episode, where the difficulty for the Mavs is that, again, they're a first apron team, so are the Miami Heat, so they can't take back more salary than they send out. And you just have kind of just a problem of there's not really a whole lot of contracts that, match up. And even if they do, you kind of have to send out a decent chunk of guys that are getting pretty consistent rotational minutes for the Mavs, right? Like you'd have to add guys like, Gafford and probably like PJ Washington or Clay and guys like that, into the deal, right? The only guy that doesn't really play a whole lot is Kleba, right? But that's still only like 11 million. So it's just not really like a realistic, destination. Like I'm sure Dallas probably will still be active in terms of looking for guys to bring in, in terms of like, other additional pieces, but probably not a star. Maybe more so role players, I think, is the more realistic scenario. And like, for Miami, what do they want back? Is it just expiring contracts? Do they want more impact pieces? That isn't really that clear. So there's all kinds of problems and difficulties with the deal like that getting done. Even more so than like the bench factor, because like he might have to be in the deal in order to make it work.
Yeah, there you go. But before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
So we have a few things to talk about, this week, starting on Monday. And it's actually pretty funny because we have, we're going to start with the NBA Cup. Then we'll probably get into the trades in a minute. But first, we'll start with the Cup games. And so we had a couple, over the weekend, right, that kind of set the stage for the final matchup. You had Hawks, Bucks, and you had OKC and the Rockets. We'll start, I guess, with OKC and Houston, right? So the Oklahoma City Thunder ended up winning 111-96, right? This was a pretty competitive game, right, for most of it, right? I'd say through the first, for the first three quarters, it was kind of back and forth, right? Obviously, kind of the main thing here was the defensive possessions, but also like even with, the open shots, nobody could really consistently hit anything. Maybe some of that has to do with how the defense was being played, a lot of up and down athletic plays made on the defensive end. But in the end, right, with the Rockets, right, it's kind of the same issue that you kind of look at as what's probably going to be their undoing come playoff time is just the lack of offense in terms of like a consistent go-to offensive guy. Obviously, it's not that all their players are, that they don't have any good offensive players. It's just you don't have a guy that you can realistically almost always turn to, late in games, right? Like Şengün, as good as he is, right? He's still not quite in that tier of superstar guys. So, you kind of have some issues there. And Hartenstein really did a good job in guarding him. I mean, he was 6 for 16. Did have, he had 13 and 11, but, just wasn't quite as impactful the way that he was against the Warriors, right? Which makes sense, right? Because, I mean, they don't have, even though they are, a really good defensive team as well, they don't have as much front court size to kind of match up with a guy like a Şengün. And then, even other guys like Jalen Green was 5 of 14, right? Minus 16 in this game. Fred VanVleet, had 9 rebounds and 7 assists, but he was 3 for 15 and he was 1 of 11 from 3, right? The ball ended up kind of finding its way into Dylan Brooks's hands, right? He took the most shots on the team, I think. Yeah, he took 17 shots and made 5 of them, right? So that's kind of the problem there. Amen Thompson off the bench was really good, 19 points, 7 rebounds, 3 steals. But just in general, right, like just not a whole lot of great offensive production from really anybody. I mean, as a team, they shot 36.5% from the field. You go over to Oklahoma City, they got up to 45%, right? SGA only shot 8 for 21, but 14 of 15 from the line, still had 32 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, 5 steals. and a block. Jalen Williams with 20 and 5 and 5. And then also Isaiah Hartenstein, right? 21 and 8. I think a career high in points for him. Just looking like a great fit next to all these guys. And that's kind of the key for Oklahoma City is just the fact, again, as we've talked about, like the fact that they're such a high level defensive team, but the upside is still there because you have, a guy in SGA who's just the offensive machine, right? Where he can kind of just get to wherever he wants and can score from wherever he wants. And you still have guys like Jalen Williams and, Hardenstein, and you don't even have Chet Holmgren, right? Like, they have, basically what, two guys that are probably better than pretty much anybody on Houston,
Hmm.
especially on the offensive end. So there's just a level of consistency that you're going to get more so from the guys on the Rockets. And that's kind of why sometimes you'll kind of hear stuff about like, are they in the market for a guy like a Jimmy Butler, right? Whereas like Oklahoma City, not really any of that. And it's difficult for them to do it anyways because they don't have a lot of those high end type of contracts that they can just move anymore, right? Like that was last year with the guys that they moved to get Gordon Hayward, I guess. But either way, like, it just continues to showcase like OKC is really good. It seems like they're the best team so far in the Western Conference. And they're not even really shooting the 3-point shot well, right? Because like last season, they were one of the best 3-point shooting teams in the NBA, but that hasn't really so far worked out this year. And it'll get better because I think these guys do have a track record of, being a really good 3-point shooting team. And that's kind of the scary part. Now, I mean, they finished the game shooting 37%, but, most of that was actually Lou Dort, right? Making like half their threes, right? And him obviously being, a real factor on both ends of the floor is great too. So, I mean, again, Houston with a good effort. I mean, in the first half, they played like the better team, but you just kind of knew that at some point OKC would start to catch fire because with as bad as OKC was on the offensive end, they were only down 1 point, right? Like SGA was pretty quiet in the first half, and then in the second half, he was able to get going, and everyone else got going, and then that was kind of just it.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, that definitely like a defensive minded game. And I think a lot of people expected that because these teams have so much defensive depth, like guys like Amon Thompson coming off the bench. And he had a great game, for Houston, but their problems continue. And I think, it was kind of how we predicted. Like I think I said in our last episode that, I thought that Oklahoma City would, kind of bring Houston back down to earth a little bit. And I think that's kind of what you saw, going into, like you said, the second half. And, they have certain depth pieces, but like you said, they don't really have like that alpha on offense, I think. And that's going to probably be their problem going forward until they figure that out. But, from the Thunder perspective, I think, I think you have to sing their praises for what they do on both ends of the floor consistently, night in, night out. Yes, sometimes they start slow, but once they do kind of get it going, I think, they're kind of the clear cut number one option in the West. And I think that kind of speaks volumes for the team that they've built. And they're missing some key guys right now. So they only have room to really get better. And I think the cup is kind of like a signifier that I think they'll have a very good postseason run.
Yeah, and that's kind of the key here is that they just look better than
Yeah.
last year's, honestly. And again, they haven't even been, completely healthy yet, right? Because again, like during the early part of the season when Chet was there, Hartenstein wasn't there.
Yes.
And then now he's come back and he's played great, but Chet's not there and he's still ways away. So this team is only going to get better. I think from here on out, once they figure out, the piece with those two bigs and kind of try to figure out, whether or not they're going to start together, close together, play together. I don't, I'm curious to see how that looks. But just getting that Hartenstein type piece, right? Just having more size as an option out there. And he still fits with what they try to do on offense because, obviously he's not taking jumpers, but he can operate in that high post or, top of the key area as a passer playmaker and find guys for easy looks. And then obviously he can get you offensive rebounds, right? He can block shots. I mean, again, we've talked about why we thought this was a great signing and being able to add pieces like that and Alex Caruso for nothing, right? I mean, like I guess they gave up Josh Giddey, but like just no picks or anything. Again, it kind of just goes to show just the smart decisions that this team has made, and now they're pretty poised to be able to make a run. It's there for them, if they want it, right? Obviously, nothing is guaranteed at this point, because there's some other really good teams in the West as well. But so far, they have the early advantage. Just again, like being able to win these games, without a guy like a Chet Holmgren there. And again, like they weren't bad. His first year when he didn't play at all, right? Like they
Yeah.
were close to like a 500 team. But just in general, right? Like just the progression from all these guys is, really impressive to see. And that's kind of the discussion that we had going into this season, right? Where it was going to be based off of can their stars, their young guys, right? That their foundational guys, can they take those leaps? And if they do, then they're going to be better than they were last season. And then if not, they'd be probably around the same. And I think so far it's pretty clear that they look better.
Yeah, they're elite. They're in like, I'm not gonna say like a tier of their own, but I feel like not league wide, but definitely in the West. I think they're like kind of running away with it at this point.
Yeah, and like that's the thing with like an SGA where I think if the Thunder can run away with it, I think can should get the MVP
Yeah, agreed.
award in from that perspective. It's not that like other guys don't deserve it or anything. Like Jokic has obviously had a great season, right? Giannis, his team is picking it up, and he was already playing well anyways.
Yeah,
But now the record is at a point where it's like, yeah, you can't really discount that anymore.
exactly.
And then obviously you can mention Tatum as well, but I just think like again we'll have to see. But like, say like they get close to 60 wins or something like that, or even more, then like
I
I
think
would
it's a
probably,
lock.
yeah, I would give it to
Yeah,
him personally. It doesn't mean he's gonna win it because
right.
obviously, because obviously I think right now most people feel like Jokic is the front runner because of the offensive contributions. And to be fair to the Nuggets, they've been playing better as well.
Sure.
So that's kind of the other key, right? Like if Denver can kind of inch up closer, right, then that and they can get like to that top three spot or so because they're pretty close, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then he'll probably get it.
Yep.
But again, like that race will be pretty cool to see. But
Mm-hmm.
kind of on Houston again, I just do kind of wonder, what they do. What's their mindset going into say like the trade deadline or anything? Like, do we
Mm.
see them realistically do anything? Because I think we talked about like there's not really pressure to do anything this season because this is kind of like the test run to see where all these guys are at. But it still kind of feels like you're probably going to have to do something, if you want to make more noise just because of the fact that, again, as we talked about, it's just kind of rough to sometimes kind of have to bank on, a guy like a Van Vliet who just hasn't had a great season offensively, or like a Jalen Green who's been up and down. He's had some high moments, but also, some lower moments. It's just kind of hard because, again, even with Şengün, like you still need a perimeter guy, I think, whether or not it's like a wing, which is why Butler's name has been mentioned, or a guard. Like you just need somebody to kind of, that can kind of get their own pretty consistently on the offensive end. And then you're kind of cooking, right? Because like your defensive personnel shouldn't take a hit, like unless they just trade like a key crucial part.
Right.
But, again, like it's still props to Houston for getting this far and being as good as they've been. Because they've been still like to me ahead of schedule. Like I think we knew they'd be better, but not necessarily like, top four in the Western Conference better.
Yeah, I agree to the point where it's like, because I would probably have my eye on Jalen Green getting moved if it's anybody, but I don't know.
Contract.
Yeah,
It's the contract.
definitely the contract. I think when that news was broken, we were like, okay, that means he's probably not
Yeah.
going to be coming back, or he's definitely going to be made available. So
Yeah. Yeah, because it's like a 3-year deal
yeah,
with the third year being a player option,
and that
right?
was the
Versus
rookie extension, right?
yeah,
And that's kind
exactly.
of unheard of normally.
Yeah, exactly. Versus like Şengün getting the 5-year max, basically,
Right,
right?
right.
Because like I think they pretty much knew what they were getting out of him.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Green, it's just again like there's still nights where he looks really impressive, but
Sure.
like say and there's other nights like this where it's like it's just kind of disappointing. And
Too
like
hot
even
and
then, like
cold.
yeah, and some of his numbers, like even at the end, were kind of like padded because the game was over, so they were actually worse than what it ended up
Yes.
looking. But he was a minus 16.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but now we're moving on over to the Hawks Bucks game. This one, I think we both picked the Milwaukee Bucks to win this one.
Yes, sir.
Not really much, for reasons that I think are kind of obvious, just from the perspective of I think you got Giannis as the difference maker, and with the supporting cast, right? Damian Lillard, also Brook Lopez, Portis off the bench, AJ Green chipping in with a few threes. And I think we kind of talked about like say the X factor would be kind of the other guys, for both of these teams, because we figured the stars would play well and they did, like Trae Young at 35, 10 and 7. Started off slow, but picked it up in the second half.
Mm-hmm.
And then Giannis, as we already mentioned, 32, 14 and 9, 10 of 15 from the field, 12 of 18 from the free throw line. Right. And then you just kind of look over, from the Bucks perspective, we already talked about those role players. They've been playing very well as a team recently, right? Where, they've completely, kind of gotten their season back on track, right? 8-2 in their last 10, 14-11, good for sixth in the Eastern Conference, right? Compared to where they were close to the bottom, right? Like a month ago.
Hmm.
So they're doing pretty good. And again, we've talked about it, right? Where, a decent chunk of it is just kind of Milwaukee kind of figuring out who some of these guys are and what their roles are on the team, right? Like now they're kind of putting more of these shooters out there with Giannis and Lillard, right? Like say, like a AJ Green wasn't as part of the rotation before, right? They were still kind of trying to figure out Pat Connaughton, right? And guys like him and Marshawn Beauchamp, they're just basically completely gone from the rotation, right? Whereas like Andre Jackson Jr. now, he starts. You got Gary Trent Jr., AJ Green off the bench, right? DeLon Wright no longer really plays. And then, Middleton, they're still kind of trying to get back on track, right? And you can see like, moments and flashes where, he can contribute, but he's still kind of rusty. Obviously, he hasn't played since the playoffs last season and he had the ankle surgeries. So, there are some elements where I think like his passing and playmaking, like he's clearly like able to kind of get Giannis in these good spots where he can find him, which, again, not much of a surprise considering how long they've played together. But it is an element where if he can get right, obviously he kind of goes back into that starting five, probably replaces, either Torian Prince or Andre Jackson Jr., right? And then you can kind of just get it rolling from there. So, they look good. They look better. This was a competitive game. Like the Bucks kind of came out firing early, and then the Hawks, made it a game and it was back and forth. It looked like the Hawks were on their way to stealing it
Hmm.
in the fourth quarter and then missed free throws, and then ultimately the stars for the Bucks kind of took over and ended the game there, right? And we've talked about it, right? Like Giannis even made a couple of middies, right, at different points, which again he's been shooting well from that area. He's got so much more space and room to roam, where he's just able to kind of take guys one on one, and if he's one on one, you can kind of almost forget about it. And again, like that's the other part that's awesome here is that he's basically playing his best basketball ever, essentially, and that's tough for a team like Atlanta to stop, where personnel wise you thought maybe, hey, they got a decent amount of athletes and wings, but in the end it just didn't really matter. And obviously, we'll get to the Hawks in a minute, but kind of talk about what you've seen from the Bucks, because I know we were not super high on this team going into the season. Like I don't think we expected them to be bad, but I think we expected them to just be all right. Like still be able to compete and contend, but not quite look as dominant. And early in the season they were awful, and now they've actually been much better, right? Where now they're winning games left and right, even against quality teams.
Yeah, I mean, it really, once again, it starts at the top. With Giannis and Dame playing the way that they do and looking, so great in this recent stretch. I think, that's the key contributor, and it definitely rubs off on other guys, like you talked about. You got quality minutes from pretty much everybody who did play. They definitely looked better than earlier in the season, and I think that is due to the fact that Giannis and Dame are playing better, and then obviously Middleton on the way back. It's just like kind of like a silver lining, glimmer of hope kind of thing. I think that's what's going on, and obviously the system looks better as well. And I think Giannis being able to shoot that mid range at that level is definitely something that takes their offense over the hump a little bit. And with the Hawks, they just didn't have anybody to really stop Giannis, and that's kind of what I think I opened, my prediction with in the last episode, where it's like I didn't think that they were going to be able to stop him, and I think that was going to be the reason why they lost the game. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Giannis continues on his MVP quest, I guess, but yeah, overall, I think you feel better about the Bucks and what they're able to do, because they do have some guys who are giving you some great effort on the defensive end and also contributing on the offensive end, but not taking away from Giannis or Dame.
Yeah, exactly. And we talked about it where defensive rating wise, they're 13th, right? So now they've been an above average defensive team. Obviously offensively, I think, they're 11th, which I feel like is a little bit more disappointing, right? Because I think you kind of expected them to be better. But again, they were bad on both ends of the floor to begin the season, which is why they were, way under 500. So now they've kind of stabilized. And I think with Middleton, your hope is offense should get better once he kind of gets his feet back under him. And then if the defense kind of hopefully stays about the same, right, then you're kind of, able to build something there where, if they're healthy, they should at least worst case scenario be formidable, because that's kind of been the biggest issue for them is the last couple of, playoffs, they just haven't been healthy, right? Like, I mean, Giannis literally didn't play at all against the Pacers. Prior to that, he played like what half the games against the Heat, and then before that, right, like Middleton wasn't there against the Celtics, right? So, I mean, that's kind of really been the issue for them, by and large. Obviously, like you also kind of wonder about the offense in crunch time, and that's why they got Lillard. And again, he's played pretty well, I think, by and large. So, not really any complaints from the Buck side. With the Hawks, again, they had been on a tear as well recently. So, obviously this was kind of a game that, I'm sure they wanted to win, right? Because
Hmm.
both teams were playing hard with a ton of effort. And the Hawks are 7-3 in their last 10 games. And again, like that's with Trae Young, offensively, not having an efficient season. Obviously, he's having, a great playmaking passing season, right? Leading the league in assists at, 12-ish a game. But again, that's kind of what you want, like, just at least from the perspective of you don't want a scenario where, because we talked about it, you don't want to be in a position where Trae Young has to average like 30 and 10 just for your team to basically be still bad, right?
Right.
Now they can get away with him having, not the greatest offensive performances and still being able to win because of the contributions they have from so many other guys. Like, Jalen Johnson in this game was probably, that's the X factor for the Hawks, right? Probably him, and then I guess Hunter off the bench. And both of them kind of had subpar offensive performances, right? Like, Hunter was 5 of 16, but then, Johnson is the one that I think is the even bigger disappointment because he's had a really, really good season as the starting forward, and he shot 6 for 15, had 10 rebounds, but, 0 of 4 from 3. So that's kind of where, if you're the Hawks, that's kind of where you feel a little bit disappointed, is that, kind of like two of your wing guys like just didn't really do much. And then even like Ricochet, right? 1 for 3, 2 points, -9, right? So that's just kind of the problem there, right? Where it's just like you just didn't get enough from, I think, some of those key contributors if you were kind of hoping to win the game. And, from the Bucks, again, you got a couple extra guys to show up in a way that the Hawks did not. And you had the stars to kind of pull it out, right? And that's kind of the key there, right? So overall, this was, I think, again, a pretty competitive game that we expected, but I think just the Bucks' high-end talent was a little too much for the Hawks to overcome. But either way, like if you're the Hawks, you still feel good about where you're at so far this season, just considering the overall conversations about Atlanta. And, again, like, yeah, they're one game above 500, but considering their over-under was 30, right, they were projected to be an awful team, and that probably just wasn't really fair to them, right? I mean, we kind of thought they'd be pretty bad as well.
Hmm.
But, seeing how they've been playing and how they look, like, this is a solid team, right? Like, I don't think this is like a high level contender championship team in the East. But like this should be a playoff team where they should be able to slide in there. And, again, probably let's say they're like, 6, 7, 8, right? Like they won't probably win a playoff series, but I think they'll probably give some of these teams a scare, right? Like they've actually matched up very well with New York, right? To the degree where it's like, if that's the 3-6 matchup, I'm not saying the Knicks are going to lose, but that's a scenario where I wouldn't be super excited about that if I'm the New York Knicks. And you just never know. But either way, like, good on the Hawks for being able to kind of turn the season around and being
Yeah.
able to play well. But the Bucks are the better team, I think, and they should be the better team.
Yeah. I don't think this is really like a surprise to anybody.
Mhm.
But I think there are things and questions that the Hawks kind of can walk away from after this game because I think,
Yeah.
do you have questions about your center room? Okongwu? Do you have questions about Capella as well? Jalen
Mhm.
Johnson, I think he can develop into that solid number two, but do you potentially make a move down the line where you bring in, somebody who fits with Trae Young, where, because if we're being honest, I know this might be like a little sidebar tangent, but Trae Young has
Mhm.
put up some crazy numbers and has some crazy accolades without ever really having another all-star teammate. So do you kind of invest in Trae Young some more and bring in an all-star, something like that? I don't know, but I think they do leave with questions for their future, but nothing to the point where they need to address it this season.
You're right. Yeah, and the tough part for them is, they are kind of missing some draft capital, right? Where they
Mm-hmm.
gave some of that to San Antonio.
Yep.
So they're probably kind of in the mix of like I don't even think they have their pick this year, right? So they don't really have a reason to be bad
Yeah.
anyways. It's just I'm kind of curious, like, because there are a couple of depth pieces that I wonder, like, do they send out like maybe to some other teams, right? Like say like a Bogdanovich or even like a DeAndre Hunter. I'm not saying you have to trade those guys, but do they possibly potentially do that? To kind of shake some things up. I don't know because, like
Right.
you said, the team is still in flux where it's a different team now compared to what it was before, right? Where when they grabbed DeJounte Murray, but I feel like Johnson's probably the guy that they're going to try to kind of develop into the all-star potentially, I think, cuz I
Agreed.
mean, they just paid him, a huge amount of money and he's been worth it so far.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of what you're banking on is,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why like he and Trey Young were considered the two guys that they were very unlikely to trade.
Makes 100% sense.
Yeah. And then, like we said with the Bucks, like again, the other added factor is the Middleton piece, where if he can, continue to get his legs back under him, that should kind of help
Yeah.
improve the Bucks. And we already talked about that, but just then that's kind of where like I think the Bucks like should have a higher ceiling than Atlanta. But
Yeah.
like I don't think that was a shocker going into the season, anyways. That wasn't really a hot take. I think it was more of a hot take to kind of say like, yeah, the Hawks are going to be somewhere in the mix for the postseason. But I think everybody was just too low on them, and I think part of that was not us necessarily, but I think there were a lot of people who seemingly were just kind of out on Trey Young. But I think, like you said, you have to add the context of like, you know, DeJounte Murray was the guy that they brought in for the as the All Star, and he ended up not, he was still good, but not quite in the ways that I think they were hoping for. And now you kind of see like you just kind of if you're the Hawks and you have Trey Young, you just kind of have to make him the central figure, and it's just kind of not really like an ideal pairing. Like
Yeah.
we talked about, like with Dyson Daniels, that's the guy where it's like that's kind of the steal, where it's like even though he can't really shoot, right? That's the guy that's like a long athletic guard that you can guard swing guy that you can put next to Trey Young, and he can kind of take on the tougher defensive assignments, right? Versus like Murray was supposed to be that, but it didn't really work out that way.
Yes, sir.
So now we have the big matchup between the Bucks and the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? This is potential finals matchup, maybe,
No.
probably not, but just obviously like two teams that are looking to contend, right? In both conferences, both teams have been playing well. Obviously, Oklahoma City's played great this season, right? They are first in the West, and they are the number one defensive team, right? So this is going to be on Tuesday, right? So in terms of the matchup, I think we kind of already said that like we're gonna pick Oklahoma. We kind of picked Oklahoma City to win it all, anyways. Like obviously not at the beginning of the cup, right? Like the teams that we picked, those teams are gone.
Yeah,
But
they were gone very
but
early.
yeah, but in terms of like the teams that are left, right? Like we picked Oklahoma City because I think they're the best team. But let's say if we're looking at the matchup, what are we looking for in terms of what are we expecting to see from both teams?
Well, I mean, from the Thunder, I'm looking to see how they game plan to stop Giannis. What is their plan to slow him down? Honestly, obviously you can't stop him, but what is your plan to make it difficult for him? Because I think the thing with Giannis is it looks easy for him night in, night out. So how are you gonna disrupt what they can do? I think one of the things that you can do is probably limit what Dame can do, because I think the more pressure that you put on Giannis, and the more things that he has to do, then you might come away with an easy victory if you take out some of the supporting cast and get rid of them. So that's kind of what I'm looking for from Oklahoma City's perspective, and then from Milwaukee, kind of the same thing. But what do you do against Shea? Limit his ability to get to the line. Kind of make him uncomfortable, take him out of his spots. I don't know how feasible that's going to be, considering the defensive personnel that you have probably isn't super well equipped to handle a guy like Shea, which is one of the reasons why I think the matchup predictor is like crazy on Oklahoma City's side. So
Mhm.
I think once again, kind of take out the supporting cast. Like, can you limit what J Dub can do, other guys as well? So that's kind of what I'm looking for from both these teams. I expect a lot of defense to be played.
Right, and that's kind of the thing where it's like, say if you're Oklahoma City, like Hardenstein is kind of the guy that like, he's the guy that's probably going to have to protect the rim
Yeah.
against the Giannis, and Oklahoma City is going to have to try to not foul, right? And again, they outside of Hardenstein, they are a small team, but they are a very fast physical team.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we talked about where they're a team that can force a lot of turnovers, right? They can get steals, they can get deflections, and if they get those deflections, they're gonna get out and run, which might be a problem for the Milwaukee Bucks. And like you said, with the SGA matchup, like Milwaukee, I guess I'm assuming Andre Jackson Jr. will probably get the assignment, right? Because of his, length and athleticism and his defensive prowess, right? Compared to like a Lillard or a Taurean Prince. Maybe Taurean Prince spends some time on him just because they're, similar sizes, I guess. But, the tough part is that with SGA, if he gets the switch onto a smaller guy, he's going to shoot over the top, say like Lopez and drop coverage. How much of an issue is that going to be, right? And again, like if it's not SGA, right, J Dub, right, presumably whoever, the number one defender is, that's going to be on SGA. But then what do you do with the next guy that's supposed to be guarding Jalen Williams? That's where that could possibly be a problem, right? Obviously, Hardenstein creating some offense at the top of the key as a passer playmaker. You're going to have to step out on that. So that's kind of what I'm looking for. And then obviously, like, can Oklahoma City, I think, kind of maybe make Milwaukee pay, for like the paint interior defense by maybe punishing them from the perimeter. That's kind of what I think you're also hoping for. And they haven't shot that well from three this season, but they did, they started to heat up, in that game against the Rockets. So that's kind of, I think, what you're looking for if you're Oklahoma City. And like you said, if you're Milwaukee, again, can you get Giannis and Dame to go off, and then can you get like a couple other guys, right? Like, could you get a good Middleton game? Could you get AJ Green hitting a few threes, Torian Prince, who's kind of cooled off the last few games, but maybe he can kind of get hot in a couple of these in this matchup. So, I mean, we figure the stars are going to play well. It's just going to kind of come down to the supporting casts and, which guys step up in this game. And again, this should be a high level, very competitive game because it's for the cup, right? Obviously, unlike the previous games, this does not count towards the team's records, right? So there's not really like any, it's so like say there's no ding to your record if you lose, but obviously both teams want to win because of, obviously you get the financial compensation, right? Where everybody gets like what, 500K
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, that can be crucial, especially for the guys down at the bottom end of the roster, right? That don't make a whole lot of money in terms of their contracts. We talked about that last season. So, like I said, I think it'll be close competitive, but I think OKC will probably be able to pull away. But again, you know, because Giannis, unlike Houston, right? Giannis, they have a Giannis, right? So they can kind of turn to that him, for offense in the fourth quarter, or Lillard, right, late in the fourth quarter in a way that Houston really can't. And so I don't think Oklahoma City can get away with the offensive performance that they had in that game. I think you'd need like a better offensive game from them if they want to be able to pull it off. Because
Yeah.
just because like you're not as scared of Houston matching you offensively, but I think the Bucks could. So that's kind of where I'm at with the matchup, but it should be a good one.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, so now moving off of the cup, we did actually have a couple of trades to get into, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess might as well start with the bigger one, right? Because I think that's the one that's, a little bit more consequential, right? If you hadn't heard already, right, the Golden State Warriors traded for Brooklyn Nets point guard Dennis Schroeder, right? They in return for, they got a 2025 Miami second round pick also to go along with Schroeder, and in return they sent to the Brooklyn Nets DeAnthony Melton, right, who obviously out for the rest of the season with a torn ACL, Reese Beekman, who's on a two-way contract, and then 3 second-round picks. So obviously, if you're the Golden State Warriors, this is a big deal from the perspective of you're adding, a guy that's having kind of one of his best seasons as a guard, starting for the Brooklyn Nets. And you look at it from the perspective of you didn't really give up anything to get him, and now you're adding him to a rotation where it's very clear that they need some help offensively off the bench, right? Where whenever Steph is off the floor, the Warriors just kind of fall apart. And, you kind of look at the roster they have, and this is what we talked about with the team going into the season, where we figured defensively they'd be better. And they are. They've been a very good defensive team this season, but the offense just hasn't quite been there. It was great earlier in the season when like literally everybody was hitting everything. But then once guys kind of cooled down and kind of went back to their normal levels, then you kind of had more of a problem. And it's really been a problem in crunch time where when the games get close, you know, they just aren't able to pull it out, right? Because you're just kind of either hoping and praying that Steph can bail you out or that somebody else can kind of make a big play. And it's just kind of not really what you want, right? Obviously for Schroeder, right? He's a guy that can get his own, right? He's, as we've mentioned, he's a quick guard. He can get to the basket, right? He's drives per game, does it more than pretty much anybody on the Warriors. He can get to the line. He's been shooting the ball really well this season, and I think that's kind of a key factor here, right? Is that say, we know he's not like a great historically 3-point shooter, but if he can knock it down, obviously that can help. Um, Presumably, you're also going to have some opportunities where Steph can kind of play off the ball a little bit more, right? And kind of play next to, I guess, more, of a guy that can play make a little bit too, right? Which they kind of tried to look for from Chris Paul, but Schroeder's going to do it in a different way. I mean, he's shooting 39% from three. They mentioned that Shams was kind of talking about the idea that he might start next to Steph, which I think is kind of interesting. But I mean, like, again, like, who is he really competing for, right? Because they've kind of been trying to figure out who that other guard next to Steph is, right? Like at the beginning of the season, they tried the big lineup with Wiggins, I guess, at the two, and then you say like Kuminga, and Draymond out there, right? Or no, I guess they had Trace Jackson Davis, but like either way, they tried to have that bigger lineup and it didn't really work. And then eventually they settled on Melton, right? Which makes sense because he can shoot, play off the ball, but also defend. But then he got hurt, unfortunately. So it's a different look. Like I think Schroeder's probably the better talent, Melton's probably the better fit. But, obviously I think it's a good trade, because if you're the Nets, you got off a guy that was helping you win games. I mean, you didn't really get much back for him, but you weren't really going to. Like they were talking about they were looking for a first. You weren't getting a first for him, right? He's on an expiring contract. So that's the other factor too. You got 3 seconds. That's, you may not feel amazing about it, but like, you kind of needed to pull the trigger just because they were kind of starting to enter the territory of we're winning too many games. We need to kind of get worse. And there's no real benefit, to just kind of waiting. And then if you're the Warriors, you get this deal done early as opposed to when we usually see these type of deals get done in February where you have like less than half the season to go. So now you can get like a test run of what it looks like. And then obviously they've talked about the idea of they're still in the market for a star, so they can still make another move. It may be a little bit more difficult because you don't have the Melton contract. But again, he should help the Warriors, right? Like, does it move them into the next tier? No, it really doesn't. But it's a good move, very low risk, and I think that's kind of the key thing here is that it's not a scenario where you had to give up, a bunch of stuff. Like you didn't have to give up your young guys, you didn't have to give up future firsts, and those are the type of deals that I think Golden State is probably going to be more comfortable with. I don't know how keen they are on just kind of sacrificing all their future assets for a deal like this. I think it would have to probably be for a deal they really, really like. I mean, they didn't really want to do it in the summer, but either way, it should help them be better, right? Just because of the fact that, again, just watch what happens when Steph isn't out there. It's really bad. And I think they were kind of hoping that some of the young guys like Pajemski could patch it up. Just hasn't worked. So I think, when with Schroeder out there, you're probably going to see less minutes from him. It'll probably reduce the amount of minutes you get from Hield just because he's also a guard, even though they can probably play together at different points. But again, it's good. It's just a factor. And also, like, he's a pesky defensive guy. He can chase after other guards on the perimeter. He gets after it. He competes. It's just not a move where I'm like, okay, you're winning the title with this move. But you had to kind of do it just because, again, you didn't have to give up anything, and it makes you better. It's just, from the perspective of the Warriors, like, you still need to do more.
Yeah. I mean, I like the move
Yeah.
because you're not really giving up anything crazy and you're getting back a player that can give you a lot off the bench for me. Me personally, I don't know if he should really be starting, but then, we talked about it off camera where like, I thought he shouldn't be starting, but then you pose the point, well, he's not really competing with a whole lot of people. And it's like, yeah, you're right. And I think bringing him in does bring a sense of stability and kind of guaranteed like, okay, this guy's going to play X amount of minutes every single night, no matter what role he's in. And I think that could be very valuable and very underrated, like you said, very low risk, very high reward because it could pan out. Like you said, he's having a career year, taking immense strides in his shooting. I know like that was a thing that kind of haunted him for years, was just not being able to really shoot the three. And if he was, it was very spotty. But this year it's been very consistent. And then obviously his playmaking ability is going to help because I think their number one goal is to preserve Steph as well as possible and as long as possible and take pressure off of him in as many ways as possible. And I think this is definitely an excellent move.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of the key here is that like you kind of want to put Steph in a position where like he's already playing like what 30 minutes a game.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of the goal this regular season where if you can kind of find ways to preserve him so that way, he's got more energy, by the end of the game. Because we talked about it, right? We're like, by the end of last season, he was pretty much like completely worn down, right? Where like
Mm-hmm.
his shot wasn't falling. And you could just kind of tell, like, with him kind of falling apart physically, the Warriors just had no shot really by that point. And so
Yeah.
now you're kind of just hoping that he can be fresher. And, like, again, also like what I talked about, again, you kind of needed to do something because the Warriors, if you hadn't noticed, if you hadn't been paying attention, they've been sliding pretty significantly because they are 2-8 in their last 10. And they were, like what, the number one seed, like maybe a few weeks ago, right? They were 12 and they started the season off 12-2. So, now they're 14-11. So they've been pretty much kind of falling apart. Now they're eighth, so they're basically right back in the play-in, which I think honestly is kind of where we expected them to be,
Mm-hmm.
right? Going into the season, I think it was more of a shocker surprise that they were where they were in the first place, right? But obviously, like, to be fair, even though they're eighth, they're like, like a few wins here and there, right, will put you like right back around like the 4 or 5 spot. So it's not like it's the end of the world or anything. It's just obviously like, they needed some more. Like in the game they played the other day between the Mavs. Now that, funny enough, was an offensive shootout, right? Where like, because actually Golden State offensively hadn't been great as of late, but in that game they were. But then if you saw like towards the end of the game, like when it was crunch time, they had nothing. They couldn't really turn to anything. But like I said, they need to do more. I think they just kind of need to kind of figure out, like, do we really want to go forward with this, young guy Kaminga experiment or not? Because I think like say in that game, Draymond's coming off the bench, right? In favor of Kaminga starting, next to like Wiggins, Looney, Steph, and Healed. And then it's like surprise, surprise, right? Like Dallas has like a crazy first quarter defense, and it's not all on Kaminga. It's just like we've talked about, where it's like I think the things that he does just they don't really fit this team. Like the way that the Warriors play, I just don't think it's going to work for him. Where, again, like they kind of talked about, a guy that covers the Nets was kind of explaining that the Warriors also wanted Cam Johnson, but the
Mm.
only way they were going to be able to realistically pull that off was if Kaminga was in the deal. And I don't think that they want to just kind of like put Kaminga in a deal, for a guy like a Cam Johnson, who is good. But I think they would probably prefer like some, which kind of like what Shams was saying, where it's like, can we get like a star? And that's kind of like where I talked about with the Schroeder deal. It's a low risk move. So I'm not necessarily saying that like they're gonna automatically give up that star or give up Kaminga for that star. It wouldn't shock me, if they just kind of held on to them. It's just the problem is that you're gonna have to pay him, and so it's like clearly they want to move him. It's just a matter of like for the right deal. It's just like hopefully for them the right deal kind of pops up soon, because I just don't think that part is going to work. Because even though he's a good player, I just, if you're the Warriors, like you're probably going to have to get a guy that's just a better fit. Ultimately, it's just kind of tough to kind of give up on a solid young player for a guy, who's a better fit. But again, you have to kind of maximize, what you got with Steph going on. And again, is it realistic to assume that even if they get these pieces, they're going to win the title? No, but I think it's at least fair. Like they have a shot. They'd have a shot just because you have Steph and you have Draymond and you clearly have a good defensive infrastructure. You just need that other offensive piece to kind of get things going. And I think Schroeder can help you get closer to that. It's just a matter of like, again, they were a team that were a few moves away, right, from being able to be like, have like a realistic shot at coming out of the Western Conference. But, at least you're closer to that. So I'm kind of curious to see how it works in terms of how it fits. But I just think in general, like, I don't have any issues with this move whatsoever. And like, there were other teams where like, yeah, you could talk yourself into, acquiring a Dennis Schroeder. But for Golden State, they had the expiring money with the Melton contract, and you had to give up nothing, like essentially like of a rotational guy. So that's the low risk factor that I'm talking about, where it's like nobody had to be sacrificed in this deal, that was playing. And obviously, like even with the Melton piece, like he could come back next season, right? Like if they liked him that much, which it seems like they did, they could easily re-sign him in the offseason, because I doubt he's going to get a ton of money anyways, just because of that injury risk. So pretty much an A grade trade for me. From the Warriors side, and from the Nets side, I guess you could say like B, just because like you got off of Dennis, you didn't really get anything back, but you weren't really going to anyways. I don't think realistically. It's just for the Nets, presumably, just like the Warriors, you're not done. You still have other pieces that I think you have to kind of determine whether or not you're going to move. And I mean, how many guys on this roster are untouchable? I mean, like
Not a lot.
anyone? Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, there are guys that I don't think they're actually going to trade, but like, there's no one on the roster where I'm like, we have to keep this guy.
Yeah, I would
You
say
know what I mean?
nobody's
So,
safe at that point.
right, exactly. Like, I guess, say like a Cam Johnson, I guess, do we expect him to possibly be a guy on the move? I guess, again, it just kind of depends because of his contract. For some teams, it may be a little bit harder to put together a deal, but, he's a guy that could help out a team. It's just a matter of, where can he go? But I think he could be an easy plug and play fit. Is just, again, he's not the only guy that I think, teams should call about. It's just, he's obviously the popular name because I think he's kind of the easiest guy to fit, compared to some of these other, like, I guess Dorian Finney-Smith is the other one, right? As like an older, but, considered more of a 3-and-D wing guy. So those are kind of the two pieces that I think most people tend to look at.
Yeah.
And then we had an additional trade, but obviously one on a much smaller scale, right? This was between the Pacers and the Miami Heat, right? The Miami Heat traded Thomas Bryant, center, to the Indiana Pacers in return for a second round pick in 2031, the right to swap, right? So actually, really a second round pick swap. So not really much to say here, just from the perspective of for the Pacers, they literally did not have a backup center. Both James Wiseman and Isaiah Jackson had torn Achilles, so their seasons are done, and they weren't able to play. And for the Pacers, you get a guy who's, again, a backup center, right? Like a guy that you can kind of just put in there. He can give you some offense, right? Obviously, both of our teams have had him,
Mm-hmm.
but obviously not like the greatest defensive guy. And obviously, he had the ACL injury a few years back, so I don't think he's like quite as explosive as he was. He sometimes can kind of space his game out to the perimeter. But again, like for the Pacers, like you literally didn't have anybody, right? Like, I mean, I
Yeah.
guess they had Moses Brown that they kind of briefly tried out. But, again, like just having a center like who will kind of, play hard in terms of offensive boards and, he can kind of, get hot offensively at different points. It's like it's the type of deal where it's like, again, very low risk. I wouldn't necessarily say high reward just because he's
No.
not in that tier of players, but it's like it's a very low risk move where it's like it's a no brainer. Like you needed a backup center desperately, and there's not really any guy in free agency that you're really wild or crazy about. So why not just pick up a guy that I don't even think the Heat were even really playing, honestly, right? So it's like and the Heat have been better as of late. So and like they didn't really need Thomas Bryant because they have other guys, and maybe that opens up minutes for Khalil Ware, possibly, maybe not. But like you didn't really need Bryant on the roster if you're Miami. Whereas if you're the Pacers, you needed somebody who's like anywhere from like 6'10" to whatever, right? Like 6'9", 6'10" or bigger, because you literally just didn't have that. I mean, like you had to kind of play guys who aren't even centers at the five. And again, like, does it change life for them? Probably not. But it is a piece where it's like, again, you needed something, and the Pacers had been struggling recently. Obviously, like they've kind of picked up a couple of wins recently, but they're still 5-5 in their last 10. So, and they're, eighth in the East. They kind of bounced back a little bit, but, again, they needed something. And, you got a center. And I think, he went to Indiana, if I'm not mistaken. So, a guy that, I guess, welcome back. Even though he never actually played for the professional team, I think he went to the college team.
Yeah. I think it's like you said, a desperation move from Indiana, and I mean he brings a certain kind of energy. Like you could tell he wants to play, and I think that's the cool thing. So that'll be an opportunity, but like you said, also not really a high reward move at all. More of a necessity, and I think it's a good thing because you didn't really give up a whole lot to get a guy who you kind of need like as a substitute.
Yeah. And that's the thing again, these are the two trades that have happened so far. So, presumably we'll have some more on the way. Maybe not immediately. Obviously, December 15th is the first day that teams can kind of start trading guys who sign contracts in the offseason. So those two deals were already made official. So those guys will be playing for their new teams relatively soon. So pretty much, from here on out to February, we're going to probably get a lot more trade rumors heating up, right? As teams are going to start trying to, figure out ways to either improve their team or sell guys off. And there's other teams that, certainly have guys that I think other teams would want. We've talked about them, many times over, and we'll probably continue to talk about them as those guys kind of, get figured out. So now we're just going to kind of pop into the news and rumors section. So Mark Stein reporting that the Pelicans are open to a Zion trade, right? So, I mean, again, it's starting to not really be that much of a surprise because it kind of feels like from the Pelicans' perspective, like it's just gone horribly. Obviously, you can talk about all the injuries, which, that's really the biggest reason here. It's just, you kind of wonder, like, at a certain point, is New Orleans possibly just kind of like ready to like wash their hands and just kind of completely start over? I'm not saying they have to, but you're almost kind of at the point now where it's like you're almost kind of willing to put pretty much anything on the table. Like, Ingram, we already know he's been in trade rumors, right? So that's a guy that I think you kind of have to look at as it's very likely or very possible that he gets moved. And again, all these guys are solid players, but they've just had so many problems in terms of staying healthy. I guess if you're the New Orleans Pelicans, I mean, like I feel like we kind of heard that before, right? Like a couple seasons ago. I think we talked about it, right? Like the first year we were doing this, right? Where there were kind of rumors about could New Orleans possibly move Zion Williamson. And again, it's just he's a very good player, but you have the injury problems and concerns. And, if you're the New Orleans Pelicans, at a certain point, there's kind of a breaking point where it just becomes too much where you kind of have to start kind of figuring out like, is this what we want to do? And I'm not saying they should just kind of give up on the Zion experiment, but it's not really a surprise that you're starting to hear it now, just because of the fact that it's just, and it just sucks, right? Because last season, up until right at the end, he played 70 plus games and, was playing pretty good basketball by the end of it. And then he gets hurt. And then, he plays this season and then gets hurt again, after it seemed like he got in the best shape that he had been in. And, I don't really know what you can really do about it at this point. Like, it may just be kind of time to hit the reset button.
Yeah, I mean, a soft rebuild might be in order here. I mean, how much more can you really invest into a player? Year in, year out, just you're not really getting much. In terms of productivity, you're getting the flashes and all the potential, but no sense of consistency or stability. And I think if that's going to be your franchise player, then that's going to be the story of your franchise. So I definitely understand that rumor.
Yeah, so I guess the question is like, would you do that? Like, would you do that? Like, are you kind of at the point where you're ready to say, move on from Zion? Because like
Yes,
obviously, like you're gonna listen to offers if they're there, but I'm saying like if you're New Orleans, are you actively now in the mindset of we have to move on from this guy?
yes, I
Okay.
am. I know that might. I don't know. I don't know if that's like the general consensus online, but yeah, for me, I'm done at this point. It's borderline bust. And I don't really know what you do from there. I guess you could potentially get somewhat of a decent haul, but I don't think you'll ever get, anything back that could really replace that. So that's where I do understand like the hesitancy from people.
Yeah, I think you at least explore maybe the other guys first, but I
Yeah.
think you're kind of at a point where it's like you do have to actually start realistically thinking about it now, right? Where it's like maybe like a few years ago you weren't, but like you said, it's just at this point probably just not going to happen, right? In terms of like being able to kind of rely on him, like you said, as like a franchise guy. And he may just be like a change of scenery guy, right? Like it may be a scenario where like you have to move him somewhere else. And then if he gets moved elsewhere, like you can look at it from the perspective of like he's someone else's problem. But it might kind of be the thing that he might actually need at this point, in order to kind of get his career back on track. So
Yeah.
I think I'm kind of with you where it's like, you kind of have to explore the options now. Like, I mean, again, there's always the possibility of like you trade him and then he plays really well and then he bites you in the butt for it. But it just doesn't feel like it's going to happen with this group, which sucks because they have a lot of talent. They have a very deep roster with a lot of guys, but it just doesn't seem like they're going to ever be able to pull it together. And then Brian Windhorst, according to him, he said the Heat star Jimmy Butler has made it known he won't pick up his player option. So we've talked about that before, where that's kind of also the issue in terms of trading for him, where it's like if you're going to do it, you have to kind of hope and pray that he's going to stay. Now, I'm going to assume a team is not going to trade for him without some type of acknowledgement from his agent that, like, yeah, he'll re-sign with you. But if you're the Miami Heat, that's kind of why, like, to me, I think you kind of have to find some type of deal for him, just because of from the perspective of like, I just don't think this Heat team is realistically going to go anywhere If with him as one of the focal pieces, like I feel like they've kind of maxed out in terms of as good as they being as good as they can be. They have played much better as of late. They're 7-3 in their last 10. So it looks like they're going to be in the playoffs. Again, it's just like, are they realistically going to be able to do a whole lot? I just
No.
don't really know about that because I don't feel like they're in the same tier as the upper group of the Eastern Conference.
Yeah, I don't. Uh, I think Miami's mid, overrated, to be honest, but it is what it is. And I thought, I think everybody knew that that was coming with the contract. So,
Yeah, exactly. And then just a couple little mini side pieces, right? According to multiple reports, guys on the Kings like Kevin Huerter and Trey Lyles are available. We know this, right? Like we know
yeah.
that they're going to be looking to make some personnel upgrades, right? According to Jake Fisher, Lakers prioritizing depth over star, which again we've talked about. Like there's just probably not really too many stars out there. And again, like if you're the Lakers, you have LeBron and AD, so you're kind of better off exploring, just other additional role players around them as opposed to, kind of putting all your pieces forward towards a star that's probably not coming.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. They definitely need to bolster up the bench and maybe get some personnel that fit around Braun and AD defensively a little bit better.
Yeah.
Um,
And then
yeah.
mhm. Yeah, and then last piece, according to the Athletic, Ime Udoka told James Harden not to sign with the Rockets and to sign with a contender and go for a championship. I mean, again, I feel like another piece of it is also like I don't think he really wanted Harden on the team, just
Hmm.
because I think like I don't think he thought that he fit what they were trying to do. Obviously, like he is obviously a very high level offensive player. But I just think if you're the Rockets, like it wouldn't have been the right move. Like, I mean, obviously it's like, well, Fred VanVleet isn't really better than Harden. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But I think, again, as like a leader guy, Van Vliet they were much higher on. But then also like Van Vliet is also a movable piece, right? And it's like a guy where it's like, yeah, again, like after this season, he's got the team option. So theoretically, they could, just jettison him off if they didn't want to bring him back, or they could re-sign him to like a smaller team friendly deal. Or they could just trade him. So I mean, like it's not really like a shocker there because I mean, like it was just kind of wild because for a while you kept hearing that Houston was looking to chase after Harden, and then it just ended up not happening. And I think for Houston that was probably the right move. And I think you're just better off if you're gonna acquire a star, go after a guy that's probably like a little closer to like being in their prime. Right, it doesn't have to be like a super young star, but maybe a guy like in the middle portion of his career, where again in the upper tier, as opposed to a Harden. I think that was just the right move for Houston. And it's not really a shocker.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess it is kind of interesting that it came from Udoka, but
Mhm.
regardless, I think Harden wouldn't have fit the mold and the timeline for real. So it
Yeah,
makes sense.
right. And like the style of play, I think like Houston, they're kind of playing like a fast, like ball movement, spread the ball around type offense, and that's not really what Harden does, right? He has the ball in his hands, about as much as anybody. And again, like he can obviously raise your team's floor for sure. It's just a matter of like, I don't think Houston was at that point, right? Like they needed to kind of see for themselves, like, whether or not these young guys individually have it. Maybe Harden could kind of make some of those pieces work together. But I think you kind of needed to see for yourself, like, which of these guys can we realistically build around? And I
Yep.
think they're kind of figuring out which guys they want to build around, as we speak.
Yes, sir.
Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on the NBA Cup. If you leave a comment, we'll read it at the beginning of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And obviously, once the cup, is over, obviously we'll talk about it in the following episode and, kind of go over and talk about how things went. So we appreciate all that, and we'll see you in the next episode.